Thanks, Andrew. So Andrew and I are located in Vancouver, British Columbia, as is the BC Nature head office in North Van. And so we just wanted to start by acknowledging that our work is held on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These are three of more than 200 First Nations in British Columbia, home to one of the world's most diverse assemblies of living Indigenous cultures. It's our commitment to pursue meaningful work with BC Nature that is respectful and acknowledges the ancestral caretakers of this land. So BC Nature is a federation of local nature clubs representing more than 56 clubs throughout BC. And we
Okay,
have,
here you
Awesome. Thank you very much, Cal.
You're welcome. If you have any problems,
sorry, I'll just mute some people really quickly. Yeah, so we have a mission called it's Know Nature and Keep It Worth Knowing. And in supporting that mission, BC Nature began working on the Municipal Protected Areas project at the beginning of 2023. Oops. So I'll just start by setting some context for this work. In 2022, the 15th conference of the parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, also known as COP15, was held in Montreal. And during this conference, many decisions were made in an effort to halt and reverse global biodiversity loss. Among these decisions was a Canadian commitment to protect 30% of Canadian land and water by 2030, which is often referred to as 30 by 30 or the 30.
That's great. 100%.
So this commitment led to the creation of the Municipal Protected Areas Project, which is a Canadian initiative with the following partners to BC Nature, including Nature Canada, Ontario Nature, Wildlands League, and the Alliance of Canadian Nature Trusts, Canadian Land Trusts, sorry, and Environment, Climate Change Canada, and others are financially supporting this project. There are a few main focuses of this initiative. First of which is simply raising awareness of this goal and the important role that municipalities, local governments, and regional districts can play. We are excited to celebrate the roles of local governments as they're in a unique position by owning and managing much of the remaining natural areas in densely populated and continuously developing areas, especially in southern Canada. Not only that, but much of the population are most familiar with their local natural areas. So we hope that in highlighting this work in people's own backyards, it will facilitate greater awareness and engagement of this project. 30 by 30 can feel like a pretty ambitious goal for some, and there are many steps involved. The first being identifying and cataloging where we currently stand, as in how much land and water is already being protected through various mechanisms, including bylaws, conservation covenants, parkland dedication, and so on and so forth. So we're here to help municipalities with this cataloging process while also encouraging additional protections, and more on that to come. So just some background information on the status of protected areas in Canada. As of 2023, the status of protected areas in Canada stands at 13.7 of its terrestrial area, which includes land and freshwater, and 14.7% of its marine territory. And in BC, protected lands cover 19.7 of the land of BC's land base as of 2023, and 3.2% of BC's marine areas, but that stat's from 2016, so it's probably a little bit more by now. Not only do we know that the amount of protected and conserved areas is important, but we also know the essential need to have protected areas throughout the entirety of BC and not just in undeveloped areas in the northern regions. And now I'll pass it over to Andrew.
Thank you.
So as you can tell by those numbers, to achieve the 30 by 30 commitment requires a comprehensive approach from all levels of government. It is recognized that local governments own or manage lands that are rich in biodiversity. It's also recognized that these rich biodiverse lands are close to communities and are important to these communities for many reasons, ranging from easy access to nature to playing a critical role in local adaptation to climate change. The federal government is aware of the amount of land suitable for the conservation database on a federal and on a provincial level, but they don't have the data for protected areas owned or managed by local governments. As such, local governments have a unique opportunity to contribute to Canada's 30 by 30 commitment. Next slide, please. So why should governments participate or local governments participate in MPAP? This project allows local governments to validate their approaches and policies for the protection of local natural areas. The project enables local governments to assist with a national commitment at a local level. It can raise the profile of local government conservation efforts. It can foster collaboration between conservation organizations and local governments. And finally, when you document what you have, you're always in a better position to seek future funding. Next slide, please. So which lands qualify? To help with assessing land for CPCAD, and for our project, we primarily focus on lands, we use an assessment tool called the Decision Support Tool. This is being developed to assess lands for CPCAD, the Conservation Database. This tool or assessment requires the following criteria to be met. Have clearly defined geographical boundaries. The geographical space being considered needs to have clearly defined and agreed upon borders. A good example of this will be a defined parkland or a land set aside for parkland. Achieve in situ conservation of biodiversity. The lands must achieve in situ conservation of biodiversity. Broadly speaking, the lands must be biodiverse. Prohibit actions incompatible with conservation. The lands are managed to conserve biodiversity, and incompatible actions for conservation are prohibited. And finally, the lands chosen to be registered in CPCAD are intended to be protected in perpetuity. Next slide, please. So what does BC Nature do? Through the financial support of ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, BC Nature can undertake the assessment of local government lands to determine if they are suitable or eligible for CPCAD, the conservation database. We rely on guidance from staff as to which lands we should assess. And typically, we assess parklands or lands zoned for conservation purposes that are rich in biodiversity. Following our assessment, we produced a list of lands that are suitable for CPCAD, review that with staff, and then we can register those lands in CPCAD. There's with the bureaucracy, there's quite a form to fill in to register these lands. We also engage with our local BC Nature clubs for ecological information on the assessed lands. And finally, we identify opportunities for existing local government lands or new lands to be conserved and protected for biodiversity. And we do this at no cost to the local government. BC Nature clubs are very important to us, and we celebrate our club members and the knowledge they have of important local natural biodiverse areas. Our club members can assist us with initial contact with local governments with respect to this project. They can help us with monitoring data of Canada sites being assessed. They can help us with pictures, and they also can undertake research through bioblitz in areas being assessed. And also, they guide us on local context, which is very important. But this slide just illustrates the diverse range of local governments that BC Nature has worked with on the 2024 CPCAD submissions. There's a deadline every year of November 30th for CPCAD submissions. And these municipalities, local governments, are some of the ones we worked with in 2024. And as you can tell from the slide, they range from large regional districts to large municipalities to small municipalities. But everyone has a role and everybody can take part in this project. Thank you. So thank you. That concludes our part of the presentation. So we will move over to Paul, who'll do his presentation, and afterwards we'll take questions on both presentations. Paul?
Thank you, Andrew and Julia, and good morning to everybody. We'll just let Julia bring up my slideshow. Thank you. So again, thank you to BC Nature for putting this together this morning. On behalf of the Land Trust Alliance of British Columbia, we do want to acknowledge the First Nations that live across the province. Our land trusts work in 40 communities in British Columbia, so we won't name all of the First Nations, but we do want to acknowledge the work that they do and how important it is to the work of land trusts. You can continue, Julia. Great. So again, we also want to acknowledge our partners in this program. The portion that the Land Trust Alliance of British Columbia is doing is under the Alliance of Canadian Land Trusts. And it's just slightly different than the work that everybody else is doing, which is getting municipal properties registered into CPCAD. The work that we're doing is primarily looking at tax incentives or other incentives that can encourage private landowners to conserve and protect their properties for the future in municipalities. So we can go ahead. The main reason land trusts exist is to protect private lands, and that's important because of clean air, clean water, flood protection, natural resources. And it's not just to protect ecologically sensitive lands, but it's also to protect habitats that provide homeland for many species at risk. So the Land Trust Alliance of British Columbia is the oldest alliance of land trusts in Canada. There are currently provincial alliances in Ontario and Quebec, and we do have a national alliance that is about 3 years old now. So in British Columbia, we serve as an umbrella organization. I tell people it's very similar to a nurses union or teachers union where we provide services like insurance programs, employee benefits, and we also do things like education, webinars, conferences, research, and publications. So that's basically what the Alliance does. Next slide. A land trust, for those of you that don't know, is a nonprofit society. All of them are registered charities with the federal government, and they exist in communities across the province to protect private lands that are important to local communities. We look at land trusts as having three distinct areas of focus. We have national land trusts like the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited that would look at landscapes that are important on a national scale. And then we have organizations like the Nature Trust of BC and the Land Conservancy, which look at landscapes that are important provincially. And then we have local community land trusts like the Nanaimo and Area Land Trust, the Fraser Valley Conservancy, that would be looking at lands that are important in those specific communities. Next slide. The land trusts in British Columbia, which are 40, have protected about 1,600 properties covering 550,000 acres. You can see some of these statistics there. About 300,000 people engage with land trusts on an annual basis, and over 3,500 volunteers help land trusts each year achieve their goals. Some of the lands that land trusts have are open to the public, and people can visit them every year, and there's about 150,000 visitors. We also try to work with many municipalities, provincial government, federal government, so that properties that are being protected are adjacent to parklands and other lands that have been protected by various levels of government. Do the next slide. And as I mentioned before, the 30 by 30 program is important to get work, sorry, work that municipalities are doing registered into CPCAD, and our portion of the program is to look at conservation options that may be available to municipalities. Next slide. So I just wanted to spend a minute talking about what the difference is between different types of conservation. So land trusts acquire land through either donations by landowners, purchases, or it could be a combination of both of those together. Their governance structure is that they have a board of directors, and about half of them have full-time staff, and they're looking at the long-term stewardship of that private land. So some of that would be natural habitats, wildlife corridors, some involve cultural and historic sites, and they do rely on private donations, grants, endowments. So that could be from municipal governments, the federal government, it could be from private foundations, corporations. And the benefit of land trusts is that they do have flexibility in managing their properties that governments may not have. Next slide. One of the frequent questions that we get from municipalities specifically is, what are the differences between all of these lands that we're trying to protect? So we've talked about land trusts, and most people, municipal staff and councillors, will recognize municipal parks like Stanley Park, Beacon Hill Park, would be parkland that is protected at the municipal level. What is not counted are green spaces that you may give a developer in terms of density and tree cover. So we hear a lot of programs about municipalities and different levels of government planting trees. Those would not be eligible to be counted because they are small and different programs than actually protecting land for the future. Next slide. So the next portion is about conservation options. We can go to the next slide. So in British Columbia, we have two main areas that land can be protected. One is a conservation covenant, which is a legal agreement between the landowner and a land trust. Some municipalities also hold conservation covenants, and this allows the title to remain with the landowner. So many of them still live on the property. What it does is outline what can and cannot happen in terms of any change to that property in terms of development. The covenant can cover the entire property or just specific parts of it. So it would allow the homeowner to live on the land. If there was another building like a barn or a garage, it would be able to stay, and the covenant would protect the natural areas of that property. Next slide. And then the second way that land trusts protect land is through actually purchasing land. And in some cases, it's a combination of the owner of the land donating some of it, the land trust buying some of it. There are tax incentive programs at the federal level, like the Ecological Gifts Program, which offer tax benefits federally for donating ecologically sensitive land. And those are all looked at independently. So you could work with your local land trust and they could work with Environment Canada to see what portion of your land is applicable for that program. Next slide. What we've been doing is looking at what incentives can be provided to landowners. We recognize all of the conservation efforts that have happened so far are really, really important, but what can we do to ensure and encourage new conservation efforts as we move forward? So LTABC has for the past 2 years been researching and having discussions with the provincial government about what incentives they could provide to municipalities to help individual landowners conserve properties that are ecologically sensitive. So we can go to the next slide. The reason we like tax incentives is because it does support goals like the 30 by 30 program. It fosters long-term sustainability in communities across the province, and it does provide conservation for future generations. It can also increase property values, which benefits local economies, and it really promotes and encourages community engagement because many of these properties are important to local municipalities and communities, and they get very involved in not only raising the money to purchase and protect these properties, but in the long-term stewardship of the land. Next slide. Many landowners, especially these days, we know are land rich and cash poor. So being willing to conserve their property is one thing, but in many cases, it can be a costly venture. So looking at incentives are very important. And as I mentioned, the Eco-Gift program at the federal level does offer some incentives to lands that meet national standards. So the Alliance in British Columbia is supporting increased incentives to private land conservation across the province. And we do have several options that we've identified. Next up. Slide. Many of you will know that in the Gulf Islands, the Natural Areas Protection Tax Exemption Program has existed for about 20 years, and it offers in the Gulf Islands a 65% tax exemption for lands that are protected by conservation covenants. And this is managed by the Islands Trust Fund. And the formula is that the tax exemption is not a reduction in taxes, but rather a tax shift. So if somebody is getting an exemption, whatever that amount is then shifted to all of the taxpayers in that zone. So instead of the municipality losing perhaps $3,000, that $3,000 would then be divided between the perhaps 10,000 taxpayers in that area. So there's no loss of tax revenue. And in the samples that we've looked at, it means, anywhere from about 10 or 15 cents to 50 cents a year increase in taxes for local landowners to protect one property. Next slide. This is a similar program in Ontario. It, however, offers 100% tax exemption on properties that are ecologically significant. And there are some size restrictions on the land that is applicable to the program. But you can see in 2020 alone, there were almost 25,000 landowners who conserved their property, protecting over 700,000 acres. So you can see the tax incentives are a very valuable tool to getting private land protected. Next slide. Another example is in Victoria, there is a heritage tax incentive program. This offers tax exemption for 10 years to offset the cost of seismic upgrading and heritage enhancements. However, the wording of this program is such that it could be adjusted to include natural heritage as well as historic heritage. So that would give municipalities the option to do tax exemptions for a limited period of up to 10 years. Next slide. We have also produced a municipal handbook that is available on our website, and this was developed specifically for municipal councillors to talk about the Alliance, land trusts, and all of the different programs that I've mentioned today, including our work in terms of tax incentives. So this is available on our website, and if you can't find it, you can just call or email our office, and we will send you a link to that. Next slide. Oh, and there you have it. We're at the end of the presentation, so I'll hand it back to Andrew and Julia for the question portion. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. That's great. Appreciate it. So now can I answer any questions either on the Municipal Protected Areas project that Julia and I are working on, or on Paul's presentation on the land tax or conservation taxes.